I am, therefore, choosing the elder. The Duke of Ravensmore spoke the words into a silent hall, and 300 years of Hartwell pride collapsed in a single breath. He had walked past the beautiful one, past the yellow curls, the pale blue silk. The daughter every soul in that house had been certain he came for. And he stopped before the woman in gray, at the back of the room. The one who lit the kitchen fires at dawn. The one her own sister called by the wrong name, year after year, to watch her flinch. Eleanor Hartwell had not been a girl in a very long time. Why would a duke who had never met her refuse the county's great beauty? What had he seen through a tree in a ruined garden the evening before? And what did he already know that no one else did? The rain came early that autumn. It worked itself into the stone walls of Thornfield Manor and stayed there like an unwanted guest no one knew how to remove. October, 1817. A bad month in a bad year for a family that had been having bad years for longer than anyone wanted to count. The West Wing had been closed for warmth. Or rather, for the impossibility of warmth. The chimneys in that part of the house had not been swept in 2 seasons, and the cost of a sweep had become one of those small luxuries the Hartwells had quietly stopped affording. Like sugar in their tea. Like new gowns for the daughters. Like the fiction that any of it would ever turn around. A woman moved through the corridors at 6:15 in the morning. 24 years old. Dressed in soft gray that had once been her mother's. Her hair pinned back without ceremony. Her hands knew which floorboard on the second landing would give them away, and she stepped over it without thinking. Eleanor Hartwell, the eldest, the quiet one, the one who knew exactly how much flour was left in the bottom of the second-best larder, and exactly how many candles remained in the box behind the silver pantry that no longer held silver. She lit the kitchen fire herself. Because the scullery maid had been let go in August, because the cook was old and her knees would not let her kneel by the grate at this hour. Because someone had to do it, and in the Hartwell household, that someone was always Eleanor. She did not resent it. She did not enjoy it. She did it the way water finds its level. By 7, she had laid out the breakfast. 2 slices of toast each. A small dish of preserves carefully measured. Tea brewed weak enough to stretch to a second pot. She did the household sums in her head while she worked. They had £4, 11 shillings remaining in the household purse. The butcher's bill was overdue. The grocer's bill was older still. The bootmaker had stopped sending his bills which was a worse sign than receiving them. The household had once kept 12 indoor servants. It now kept 3. Thomas the butler, who had not been paid since July, and who had stopped raising the matter because raising it would have the first thing to actually break the house in half. Mrs. Pollard the cook, whose knees were going. A girl called Hannah, who came in from the village 3 mornings a week, and was paid in eggs. The rest of the rooms gathered dust. Eleanor dusted what she could. She could not, with 3 pairs of hands including her own, dust everything. So she dusted the rooms that visitors might see, and let the rest of the house go quietly back to the country it had been built on. Her mother came down at 7:30. Lady Margaret Hartwell, 50 years old, fluttering in a lace cap that had been mended 3 times in the same place. She had the careful walk of a woman who had stopped trusting the floors of her own house. Anything? The voice carried that particular brittleness it had taken on years ago now. The brittleness of waiting for some piece of news that never came. Nothing yet, Mama? Your father? In the library, which was a polite way of saying her father was sitting in the dark, in a cold room, staring at a desk full of letters he could not bring himself to open. The Hartwells had a great deal of polite language for things they could not say plainly. They had needed to develop it. They could not afford the alternative. Eleanor poured her mother a cup of tea, set it down, pulled out the chair. Lady Margaret sat the way a woman sits when she has stopped expecting any particular morning to be better than the one before. The wind outside took the bare branches of the rowan by the kitchen door and rattled them against the glass. Eleanor did not flinch. She had been listening to that sound for 20 years. She would not, in any of this, have called herself unhappy. Unhappiness suggested some other arrangement was possible. Eleanor had spent her 24 years observing that arrangements in this country were not generally possible. They were given. You accepted them. The women in books who fought their arrangements seemed to her to have been written by people who had never tried it. What she felt, instead, was tired. A specific kind of tiredness. The kind that comes from being needed in a house and every hour of every day, and being noticed by that same house perhaps 3 times a year. She had, somewhere around the age of 19, stopped looking at herself in mirrors longer than was needed to pin her hair. She did not anymore want to know what she looked like by the day. She had worked out, with a kind of weary mathematical clarity, that beauty in this house had been allocated to her sister, and that this allocation was final. She had stopped contesting the math, what she had kept, instead, for small things. The library on the 3rd floor, where the books had not all been sold. The bench in the rose garden in summer. The hour between 5 and 6 in the morning when she had the whole house to herself and could pretend, briefly, that she lived in it as a person rather than as a feature. This was the hour she was in now. She finished the silver tray. She set it down. She looked for a moment at her own thin hands in the gray light coming through the high window over the scullery sink. I am 24, she thought, with no particular feeling. I look older than my mother did at 24. I have seen the portrait in the gallery. She was a girl. I have not been a girl in a long time. The thought did not sting. It was simply a fact. She filed it the way she filed most facts. And she went to call her mother to breakfast. Cordelia did not come down until past 9. When she did, she came down like weather. Like a small front of pink silk and yellow curls, displeased with everything that crossed her path. She was 19. She knew herself to be beautiful, because the world had been telling her so since she was 4 years old. She had built her entire interior life around that single fact, the way a town might be built around a single mine. This room is freezing. Cordelia pulled her shawl tighter and dropped into her chair without greeting anyone. Is the toast cold again? Of course it is. Eat it anyway, dear Lady Margaret, mild, distant, already half retreated into her own embroidery hoop and the small private world stitched inside it. And the tea is weak. Eleanor poured her sister a cup without looking up. Then drink it strong, Cordelia. Make a great inner effort. Cordelia narrowed her eyes. The kind of look that, on a less pretty woman, would have been called sullen. On her, it had always been treated as charming. Don't be clever, Louisa. It doesn't suit you. Eleanor's name was not Louisa. Cordelia knew it. Cordelia just had a habit of calling her sister names that did not belong to her, the way a child renames a dog every week to test what sticks. It was a small cruelty. It had been going on for years. Eleanor had stopped, somewhere around the age of 17, expecting it to stop, so Eleanor ate her toast, and drank her tea, and said nothing, because saying anything was a kind of giving Cordelia exactly what she wanted. Because she had stopped, some years ago, expecting any other kind of breakfast. There was a silence. The kind of silence that family's perfect. Lady Margaret pulled out a piece of mending and pretended to be absorbed in it. Cordelia spread preserves across her toast in a thin, even layer that she would not, in the end, eat. I am going to die in this house, Cordelia said. To the ceiling, you are not going to die in this house, Cordelia. I am going to die here. Of cold, of bad tea. Of the unspeakable shame of having to wear the same gown to the Wallaces on Tuesday that I wore to the Wallaces last Tuesday. The Wallaces did not have a Tuesday gathering. The Wallaces had not held any gathering for 19 months. It was not, Eleanor noted, Cordelia found inconvenient. You are not going to die. I am. And when I do you know what the inscription on my stone shall read? Here lies Cordelia Hartwell. She was very nearly something, but her family let her rot. Eleanor set down her cup very carefully. She did not allow herself the small sigh she felt rising in her chest. She had learned, some years ago, that the sigh was the moment Cordelia would seize on. The sigh was a public admission of weariness, and Cordelia, like a small clever animal, could smell weariness from across a room and would use it. "You are 19, Eleanor said. "There is statistically time." Cordelia laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a person preparing to wound, statistically. "Listen to her, statistically, Mama." As if Mr. Newton himself had taken an interest in my prospects. Lady Margaret did not look up from her mending. Lady Margaret had, over 23 years, perfected the art of not being in any particular room she happened to be sitting in. Eleanor stood. The chair scraped. The morning had begun, and the morning would go on. And there were 3 more hours of small acts to perform before luncheon, and 10 more after that until she could close her bedroom door behind her again, and be done with it for 1 more day. She gathered up the silver. She started toward the door. Cordelia called after her in the bright, pleased voice of someone who has just thought of a thing she had been holding back. "Oh, Louisa, the mending in the linen press. Mama's good shawl. Do see to it before tea, will you? I should like to wear it tonight." Eleanor did not turn. "Yes, Cordelia. You are useful at that. Yes, Cordelia." She closed the breakfast room door behind her. In the corridor, she stood for half-second, with the silver tray pressed against her ribs. She did not cry. She had stopped crying some years before, when she had worked out that her tears, in this house, were a currency only her sister knew how to spend. She straightened the tray. She started for the linen press. The morning went on. The post came at 10. It was the only event in the daily life of Thornfield Manor that anyone still anticipated. And even then they anticipated it, the way a condemned man anticipates the chaplain. With dread and a strange relief that the waiting would soon be over, Thomas brought the silver tray to the morning room. The silver had not been polished since June. He set the tray before Sir Reginald. 1 letter. A heavy seal in dark blue wax. Sir Reginald Hartwell stared at it, for what felt like a quarter of an hour, but was probably 10 seconds. His hands were not quite trembling. They were too proud to tremble, but there was a stillness in them that suggested the trembling was very close. "Open it, Reggie, Lady Margaret." Soft, almost a whisper. He cracked the seal. The room was very quiet. Even the fire seemed to have politely stopped its small cracklings to give him room. His eyes moved across the page. Once. Twice. His face went through several distinct weathers in the space of perhaps 15 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, a flush. And then, last and strangest, something almost like fear. "My word." Half a breath, half a prayer. "My word." "What is it, Ravensmore?" He did not seem to know he had spoken. He was reading again. The Duke of Ravensmore, Cordelia, who had been examining her own reflection in the back of a spoon, snapped to attention so quickly the spoon clattered against her plate. The Duke of what? Of Ravensmore. Child, the Duke of Ravensmore. She tasted the words as if they were a sweet she had not been allowed in years. The Duke of Ravensmore wrote to us. The Duke of Ravensmore was a name that did certain things to a drawing room when it was spoken. He was unmarried, which made him interesting. He was rich, which made him very interesting. He was reclusive to the point of legend, which made him, in the imagination of a Cordelia Hartwell, perfect. "Write it, father." Cordelia had not blinked. "Read it aloud." Sir Reginald read in a voice that did not feel like his own. "His Grace's man of business proposes a contract to settle the outstanding obligations of this house in full." His throat worked. "In exchange. For a marriage to my daughter." Silence. A different silence than before. A silence that had a hum inside it. Cordelia laughed. A small, bright laugh. The laugh of someone receiving a gift she had been certain was coming all along, and was only mildly impatient that it had taken this long. Well. She smoothed her gown. Well, of course. She turned to look at her reflection again, in a different angle of the spoon, and tilted her head as though already trying out posture for a new title. The Duchess of Ravensmore. Yes. It has a sound to it. It has, I think, a rather lovely sound to it. No one corrected her. No one had to. Because no one in that room thought that the offer could be for anyone but her. Not her mother. Not her father. Not Cordelia. Not even, if she was honest, Eleanor herself. Eleanor stood by the sideboard with the teapot in her hand. She had paused mid-pour. The tea had gone cold in the cup beneath her. She was not jealous. She would not have known how. Jealousy required a fundamental belief that you, too, deserved the thing. Eleanor had been very thoroughly taught that she did not. What she felt, in that moment, was an enormous and strange relief. The Hartwells would be saved. Her father would not, after all, end his days in a debtor's prison. Her mother could keep the cottage they had been quietly negotiating for in Bath. Cordelia could go to her opera and her Mayfair house. And Eleanor herself. Eleanor would, in time, become some sort of poor relation in a corner of a grand house, a maiden aunt, a useful woman, holding someone else's children, folding someone else's linens, disappearing politely. Year by year, it was not a future to weep over. She had spent her whole life learning not to weep over futures. She set the teapot down. She turned to leave the room. "Stay, Eleanor," her father's voice, suddenly. "Stay. There is a great deal to be done." Of course there was. There was always a great deal to be done. And Eleanor would do it. Sir Reginald rose and began to pace. The Duke would arrive on Friday. 3 days. 3 days to make Thornfield look less like a slow burial, and more like a residence that the future Duchess of one of the great northern houses might plausibly have come from. Linens. The East Guest Suite. The wines. The gardens. "Eleanor, the gardens are a disgrace." "Yes, father. And the front hall has not been." "Yes, father, and your sister will need—" "Yes, father." By 11 o'clock, Eleanor had a list 2 pages long and a household of anti-Regency-era to accomplish it with. By noon, she had stopped feeling anything at all. She had moved into the part of the day where feeling is a luxury, and the only thing left is the small, steady doing of what is in front of you. She had spent a great deal of her life there. It was not, by now, an unfamiliar country. Cordelia, meanwhile, had taken herself upstairs to begin the deep and serious project of choosing what she would wear. The project would, by Eleanor's estimate, occupy most of the next 3 days. It would also, by tradition, conclude with a tantrum, requiring at least 2 hours of Eleanor's particular attention. She made a mental note to allow for it in the schedule. She had learned, in years of running this house, to allow for everything. 190 miles to the south, in a paneled solicitor's office on Lincoln's Inn Fields. The 6th Duke of Ravensmore stood at a window and watched the rain come down on a London he had never learned to love. 32 years old. Tall, black coat, black hair pulled back without affectation, gray eyes that had been told more than once that they were intimidating, which had never struck him as a compliment. Sebastian, the given name his mother had used, the one almost no one used now. His mother had been dead 8 years. The rest of the world called him Your Grace, or Ravensmore, or, behind certain doors, the cold one of the family, which he knew about and did not bother to correct. The letter from Sir Reginald Hartwell sat on the desk behind him. Acceptance. Of course it was acceptance. A man drowning does not refuse a rope. "It is settled, Your Grace." Mr. Atherton, his man of business, 60 years old. 2 pairs of spectacles, one perched on his head, one on his nose, and never once, in Sebastian's memory, the right one in the right place. "It is settled," Sebastian repeated, mostly to himself, as if hearing the words in his own voice might make them feel like a decision he had actually made, rather than a thing that had happened to him. "The dowry will be released on the day of the marriage. 20,000, plus the additional sums tied up in the Reading bonds. A clear 43,000 all told. It will not solve everything, Your Grace. But it will buy me time at Tinmere. Yes, Your Grace, Tinmere. The Silvers, mine in the north, that fed 2,000 souls, and was at the moment 3 weeks away from drowning under a flood. His father's foolish economies had failed to drain. Sebastian thought of Tinmere the way other men thought about their own children. With a particular and exhausted love. He had not chosen his title. He had not chosen the debts. He had not chosen the kind of father who could lose £40,000 at cards in a single year, and leave his only son, a duke at 27, with nothing but a name and a ruin attached to it. His father had been a man of grand appetites and small judgments. The fifth Duke of Ravensmore had liked horses, but he had liked them most when they were running for him at long odds. He had liked claret. He had liked the company of clever men who flattered him in expensive rooms. He had not, particularly, liked the slow, steady work of running an estate, and so he had not done it, and so it was not done when he died. And Sebastian had inherited not a property but a careful arrangement of unpaid promises, stretching across most of 3 counties. For 5 years now, Sebastian had been holding it together. Quietly, without ceremony, he had sold off 2 of the smaller properties. He had let go of the London staff at all but the Grosvenor Square's house. He had stopped buying clothes. He had stopped, very particularly, keeping the company of his father's old friends, who had treated him in his first months as the new duke the way you treat a young dog who might be persuaded to give up his bone. He was now considered, in those drawing rooms he no longer entered, a cold misanthrope, a miser, a man without grace. He found, on the whole, that this suited him better than the reputation his father had enjoyed, which had been of great charm and active treachery, but he could not save Tinmere on cold reputation alone. The pump had failed for the 3rd time in a year. He had no liquid funds. The only liquid funds available to him were attached to the dowry of an obscure baronet's daughter, from a tumble-down manor in the middle of nowhere, whose maternal grandmother had been the only sensible Hartwell in 3 generations, and had locked the money up against the day her granddaughter married. He had no preference for the daughter. He had not asked her name. He had asked Mr. Atherton 3 questions about the family, all financial, and 1 question about the daughter, which had been, is she of marriageable age? The answer had been yes. He had instructed Mr. Atherton to write. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Mr. Atherton was looking at him with the careful, patient expression of a man who had been a family solicitor for 40 years, and had learned, somewhere along the way, that dukes will tell you what they intend to do, whether you have asked or not, if you simply wait. Atherton, your grace, Crotts, catample the carriage. There was a small silence, then a very polite cough. Your grace? I will ride. To Thornfield? To Thornfield, alone, alone. Atherton's spectacles, both pairs at once, somehow communicated alarm. Your grace, Sir Reginald is expecting a formal arrival. The carriage, your livery, the footman, he has, I do not doubt, made all of his preparations on that assumption. He has. Sebastian almost smiled. The expression did not quite reach his mouth, which is precisely why I will not arrive that way. Not on Friday. I will arrive on Thursday, in plain clothes, on horseback, and I will not be announced. Your grace, I must. I am about to sign my name to the rest of my life, Atherton. I should like to see this family as they are, not as they will arrange themselves to appear. Atherton said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, May I ask what you expect to find, your grace? Sebastian considered the question. He was not, by nature, a man who answered questions on impulse. I expect to find a desperate father and a vain daughter, and I would like to see them, plainly, before I sign my name to either one of them. He did not know yet that he was about to find a third thing. He could not have known. He rode out of London on Tuesday afternoon, a black horse, a plain dark coat, saddlebags with 2 changes of linen, and nothing that would identify him as a duke. He stayed at indifferent inns. He paid in coin. He let the innkeepers think he was a land agent, or a younger son with a small living somewhere quiet, and they served him cold beef and warm beer and nodded him to small clean rooms at the back. It was, in its strange way, the first peace he had felt in 5 years. He had not realized, until he was 40 miles north of the city, how heavily the consciousness of his title sat on his shoulders most days. Out here, he was no one. The road did not care. The horse did not care. The November light fell on his hat the way it fell on every other hat on the road, with no special attention to rank. He thought, somewhere on the second day, that this was perhaps the closest thing to a holiday he had taken since his coming of age. The thought made him smile, briefly. He had no holidays in his future. He had a wedding. He had a flooded mine. He had a debt schedule that needed to be met by the end of the calendar year. He had decided, somewhere in the slow rhythm of the road, that the small private pleasure of riding alone for 3 days was the last selfish thing he intended to do for a very long time. By Thursday afternoon, he was on the road that climbed up through the wet woods toward Thornfield Manor. The trees were in full color. The kind of autumn the poets liked. He noticed it without enjoying it. He had been at this work too long to enjoy weather. He came up to the house from the back, not the front drive. He had no intention of letting them know he was here. He led the horse around to the stables and gave him into the hands of a boy of perhaps 14 who looked, briefly, as if he had never seen anything quite that fine on 4 legs. Rub him down. Good feed. I am here on business for His Grace. The boy nodded and asked no questions. The boy, like everyone else at Thornfield, had been trained by hunger to ask very few. Sebastian moved from the stables, slow, hat low, keeping to the shadows of the long yew hedge that ran along the kitchen garden. The house smelled of wet leaves and something braising. Mutton, by the cheaper cuts of it. He noted the smell the way a doctor notes a symptom. He stopped briefly in the shelter of the yew, and he looked at the house itself. It was the carcass of what had once been a handsome late Stuart manor. The proportions were good. The stone was the soft local limestone, weathered to a sad mottled gray. The windows had not all been washed in some time, and on the upper floor 2 of the panes had cracks across them, mended with a strip of waxed paper. The slates on the south face of the roof had begun to slip. A bird's nest, recently abandoned, hung in the crook of one of the chimneys. There were no fires lit upstairs that he could see. The house was holding its warmth, as houses in trouble do, in only a few rooms. He had seen the books on this house. He knew, to the shilling, what Sir Reginald owed. But there is a difference between knowing a sum on a page and seeing the sum sitting in front of you, in the shape of a tired old building. He stood there for a long minute. He did not feel pity. He had been raised out of pity. He felt instead a small interior recognition that the family inside this house had been very near the end of their road for a long time. He moved on. Around the corner of the kitchen garden. Past the abandoned glass house, which had lost most of its panes. Past a small stone basin that had once held a fountain and now held leaves. It was nearly dusk when he heard voices, 2 of them, female, carrying across the damp air with the small unflattering clarity that damp air gives to voices. He stopped. He listened. He stepped, slowly, into the deeper shadow of an old oak whose branches drooped against the wall of the kitchen garden. And he settled there. He had not planned to eavesdrop. He had planned to observe. But you cannot, sometimes, choose what the world hands you. The garden had been beautiful once. He could see the bones of it, the stone bench, the trellis, the hardy old roses that had outlived 3 generations of gardeners and still pushed out a few fading blooms in defiance of October. 2 figures sat on the bench. The light was failing. He could see them well enough. One was the brightness, the yellow curls. Even in the dimming light she shone, the way certain women do, by some accident of pigment and angle. She was speaking. She had been speaking, it sounded like, for some time. The other was a quiet shape beside her, gray. Folded into herself, he recognized the type before he recognized the people. The flower and the shadow. He had grown up in houses full of such pairings. It is an outrage, the bright one, an absolute outrage. He should have been here today. I have been ready since dawn, do you understand? Since dawn. A small silence. The shadow did not answer. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to maintain a look of perfect radiance for an entire afternoon, Louisa? The shadow mildly. My name is Eleanor, don't be dull, do you? No, Cordelia, I do not. Of course you do not. You have never tried. Cordelia plucked at the sleeve of her gown. Mama says I am to wear this tonight, this. It is 3 seasons out of fashion. 3. He will think we are paupers. We are paupers. It was said so plainly, Sebastian almost laughed. He did not. The laugh stayed in his throat. But it was the first thing in days that had nearly produced one. Not for long, Cordelia said. Once I am settled. Once I am the Duchess of Ravensmore, I shall have everything. A house in Mayfair. A box at the opera. Jewels, I shall burn every gown I currently own. I shall never, ever, wear lavender again. Then I am glad for you. You should be ecstatic for me. Do you know what this means? It means we are saved. It means Papa stops drinking himself blind in the library. It means Mama stops mending the same cap forever. It means a roof. It means food. It means a man you have never met. Yes, you are not afraid of that? Of what? Of a man you have never met. Cordelia laughed. The laugh was harder than the previous one. Less practiced. He is said to be very rich, Louisa. Very. So he had better be. It is the only thing that could make him tolerable. They say he is cold as a tomb, ancient probably. Wrinkled, smells of horses. But the debts will be paid and I shall be a duchess. A small pause. The pause of a person preparing to say a thing she has been turning over in her mouth all afternoon. And listen. Once I am settled. Once the Duke has served his purpose. There is always Lord Edmund Blackmore, Cordelia. Don't Cordelia me. He has always admired me. Always, and he is far younger and far handsomer than any duke I have heard of. Cordelia, a duchess can have her little secrets, Louisa. Can she not? Not Sebastian, behind the oak, became very still. Not with shock. He had expected something like vanity. He had expected something like greed. He was not above either in moderate quantities. The world ran on both, but this was a planned betrayal. A betrayal arranged carefully, before the bargain itself had been struck. The dowry would not evidently be enough. There was a husband to be made a fool of in advance, a title to be enjoyed, a lover to be promoted from admirer to consort, a whole quiet calendar of cruelty already laid out. Before the ink on his name was even dry, he felt a thing he had not felt in a long time, a clean, cold thing. He almost did not recognize it. It was anger. He very nearly turned then, and walked back to the stable and called for his horse, and rode through the night back to London. He very nearly let Tinmere drown and the great house of Ravensmore crumble before tying himself to that. He very nearly did. But the shadow on the bench spoke. You should not say such things, Cordelia. The voice was low. It was also, somehow, very tired. Why? Because you are building something on sand. You think you are buying a life. You are not. You are buying a stage. And stages collapse. What? A title is a thing other people decide to keep calling you. It is not yours. Kindness is yours. Honesty is yours. The way you treat a maid when you think no one is watching is yours. None of the rest of it is. You cannot keep it. Oh. Cordelia's voice brittle now. Brittle the way ice is brittle the day before it breaks. Oh, Eleanor, with your little sermons, with your little gray sermons in your little gray dress. That is why you are the one in mourning for nothing, and I am the one who will be her grace. Kindness does not pay the butcher. Honesty does not buy a new gown. The shadow did not answer. You are a fool, Eleanor. A small, dim, dull fool. And I love you, I do. But for God's sake, do not preach at me on the day my entire life is finally about to turn to me. There was a rustle, skirts. Cordelia rose. I am going inside. It is damp. My hair will frizz. Do not be long. I shall need you to help me dress for dinner. You are useful at that, at least. She swept off across the gravel, pink in the deepening gray. Pink and certain and gone. The shadow on the bench did not move. Sebastian, in his hiding, did not move either. For a long minute there were only the small sounds. A pigeon set somewhere overhead, the slow drip of last night's water from the trellis, the damp. And then, slowly, the shadow leaned forward and put her hand against the nearest of the fading roses. She did not pluck it. She did not even hold it. She only touched, with one finger, the edge of one wilting petal, as if she were apologizing to it. For being unable to keep it alive, she did not weep. She did not seem even to consider weeping. She had not the energy for it. Or she had, perhaps, decided weeping a long time ago and concluded that weeping had no place in a house like hers. She only sat and touched, thus rose, and breathed, and Sebastian, the 6th Duke of Ravensmore, who had ridden 190 miles in plain clothes to look upon a family without being lied to, who had come prepared to despise a Hartwell and ride out by morning the same poorer man he had been the day before, found that something in him had moved, quietly, without his consent. In some interior room he had not visited in years. The contract, he thought. The contract specifies a marriage to Miss Hartwell. It does not, he thought, very carefully specify which one. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the small window of the inn at the village 2 miles down the road, a candle on the sill, and he thought. The kind of thinking a man does when he has just decided to stop being a man who had previously made a particular kind of decision. He thought about his father. The fifth Duke had married a woman who suited him for everything except the small, awkward business of bearing his loneliness. She had been the daughter of a Welsh earl, beautiful in the manner of expensive porcelain, and she had spent her last decade in rooms with too many candles, trying to outshine her own quiet despair. Sebastian had been 24 when she died, old enough to understand the shape of her unhappiness. Too young to know what to do about it. He thought about Tinmere. About 2,000 families who would never know the names of any of the people in this whole long, sordid arrangement, and whose breakfast on Monday morning depended on it anyway. He thought about Mr. Pawley, the foreman, who had been writing him weekly reports for 3 months with the polite restraint of a man delivering news of a slow death. He thought about the girl on the bench, about the way she had touched that rose, about her quiet final sentence to her sister. The way you treat a maid when you think no one is watching is yours, and how absolutely no one in his world had ever said such a thing in his hearing. He thought, briefly, about what it would be like to marry the other one, to stand in a church beside a beautiful 19-year-old who was already, in her head, walking out of his house on Lord Edmund Blackmore's arm. He thought about the years that would follow, the whispered jokes at his expense, the slow erosion of whatever was left of his name, the eventual public scandal. He thought, then, about what it would be like to marry the elder one. He could not, at first, picture any of it. He could not picture a life with a woman whose face he had not yet, in any clear light, seen. He could picture only the back of her gray gown, and her hand on the rose, and the small flat way she had said, "We are paupers." He had not, in his life, been particularly drawn to women. He had not avoided them, exactly. He had simply found, in the kinds of rooms his rank required him to enter, that the women he was meant to consider had been raised to consider him in a way he found exhausting. They wanted the title. They wanted the income. They wanted, some of them, his face, which had been admired more than he liked to admit. They had not, at any point in his 32 years, wanted him. The girl on the bench had not wanted any of those things. She had not, in fact, known he was there. He sat at the window until the candle guttered. He watched the slow pink of an English autumn dawn come up over the wood at the back of the inn yard, and then he washed his face in cold water and put on his black coat and rode back up the hill toward Thornfield Manor, because he had decided the Duke of Ravensmore, his father's son, his mother's son, the inheritor of his name and his debt and his ancient title, was not a man who unmade a decision once it had been made, at Thornfield. The morning was a small panic. Cordelia had been awake since 5. She had changed her gown 3 times. She had quarreled with her mother twice. She had spoken to her sister not at all. Eleanor moved through the house, attending to it. Coffee that none of them could afford was being brewed. The hall floor had been polished with the last of the household's wax. The carriage drive had been raked, because Sir Reginald had insisted, even though no carriage was due to arrive on it until past noon. At 11, Cordelia took up her station in the hall in pale blue silk, cheek pinched for color and lifted, eyes downcast in what she imagined was modesty, and what was in fact a calculation about candlelight angle. Lady Margaret hovered. Sir Reginald stood by the door in his only good coat, the one that did not quite fit at the shoulders any longer. Eleanor stood at the back, near the door to the corridor that led to the kitchens, ready, as she had always been ready, to step out of the way of whatever was about to happen. Noon struck. A horse on the gravel, then a second, then a coach. Thomas opened the front door. The Duke of Ravensmore stepped down, black coat, black hair, plain. Severe, he was not ancient. He was not wrinkled. He did not smell of horses. He was tall and quiet and entirely awake, and his gray eyes did not stop moving as they passed across the assembled Hartwells, taking each one in. He looked at Sir Reginald, who was stuttering through a welcome. He looked at Lady Margaret, who was nearly curtsying herself into the wall. He looked at Cordelia, who had drawn herself up to her best radiant angle. He looked at Cordelia for a very particular length of time. Then his eyes traveled past her and found Eleanor in the back of the hall. It was perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 4. The whole hall was so quiet you could hear the floorboards complaining at someone's small unconscious movement of weight. Eleanor felt the look more than she saw it. It went into her like a hand placed on her chest. There was something in his face, a recognition that made no sense to her. She had never met this man. She had never seen this man. And yet he was looking at her the way you look at a place you have been before and have come back to with intent. He turned to Sir Reginald. "I have reviewed the terms of our agreement. Excellent, excellent, Your Grace. Yes, my daughter, Cordelia, is overjoyed to make." The Duke did not let him finish. He stopped. He walked past Cordelia, directly past her, as if she were a piece of furniture he had not, on inspection, decided to keep. He stopped in front of Eleanor. The hall did not breathe. "You are Miss Hartwell." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact placed before her, like a document to be signed. She found her voice somewhere behind her ribs. "I am, Your Grace." He inclined his head. Just a fraction. A formal acknowledgement. Then, in a voice that was perfectly clear, and was certainly heard in every corner of that room, "The contract specifies a marriage to Miss Hartwell. Sir Reginald, you have 2 daughters. I am, therefore, choosing the elder." The hall did not breathe. Then Cordelia made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a small animal makes when something it had been about to swallow is taken from its mouth. "No, Cordelia," her father faint. "No, no, no, he wants me. Of course he wants me. Father, tell him, Your Grace." Lady Margaret had stepped forward, her hands fluttering, her face pale. "Your Grace, there is some confusion, surely. Cordelia is the beauty of the county. Cordelia is the one who there is no confusion, Lady Hartwell. But Eleanor is." She faltered. She could not find the word. She had been about to say something terrible. She did not, in the end, manage to say it. The Duke's eyes had moved to her, and she had stopped, the way a person stops at the edge of a great drop without knowing why. He held out his hand, gloved, steady. Open between him and Eleanor. It was a question without language. He did not look as if he intended to ask it twice. Eleanor stared at the glove for a long second. Her thoughts were not thoughts. They were a small wind moving through her, made up of every afternoon she had spent in this hall, in this gray dress, holding doors, fetching shawls, smoothing her mother's hair, listening to her sister's complaints, becoming a small useful piece of the furniture of a house that had been able to dispose of her now anyway. She looked, once, at her family. She saw their faces. It was not concern for her. It had not been concern for her since perhaps the day Cordelia was born. They were looking at the loss of a thing they had counted on. The thing was not her happiness. The thing was Cordelia's coronet. She looked back at the Duke. His face had not changed. His hand had not moved. He was waiting. He had given her the choice. He had walked all the way into a strange house, in front of strangers, and offered her, in plain sight of every person who had spent 24 years overlooking her, a way out. She did not know why. She had never been less sure of anything in her life, and she had never been more certain of an answer. She lifted her chin. She did the small, practical thing she had always done. She put her hand into his. His glove closed around her fingers. Firm. Warm through the leather. Final. "I accept, Your Grace." Her voice was quiet. It was also the steadiest sound that had been made in that hall in a year. The wedding took place on the 3rd morning after. The parish church on the edge of Thornfield Land had not been used for any happy occasion in 9 years, and the vicar, a thin, slightly stunned man named Mr. Penrose, looked through the service like a man reading a play he had never seen performed. Eleanor wore dove-gray silk. Not white. White, She had said quietly to the modiste who had been sent from York, was for women who imagined themselves at the start of something. She did not imagine herself at the start of anything. She intended to wear the gown again. The modiste, who had dressed 3 duchesses in her career, had stared at her for a long moment and then nodded once and said nothing. The dress fit her like armor. Sebastian stood at the altar in plain black, no regalia, no ceremonial sword. Nothing that suggested the lineage now folding itself. In front of God and the vicar of Thornfield, onto the wrist of a baronet's elder daughter from a falling-down manor. He watched her walk the short aisle. She moved the way a person moves who has spent her life carrying things she did not want to drop. There was no performance in it. He found briefly that he had stopped breathing. Her hand was small in his when he took it, cold, steady. They said the words, she said them clearly. He said them in the low register that always seemed to make floorboards take notice. The ring slid on, plain gold. He had bought it himself in a side street in London, from a goldsmith who had no idea who he was selling to and named a price like a man naming a price to a stranger. Sir Reginald wept, very quietly, in the second pew. Lady Margaret blew her nose into a handkerchief that had a small embroidered flower in the corner, and a small embroidered patch beside it, where the flower had once had a twin. Cordelia did not attend. She had not, since the choice, left her bedroom. The breakfast that followed was brief and excruciating. There were toasts. Sir Reginald, on his feet, lost his thread twice and recovered by raising his glass and saying simply, "To the new Duke, sir, my profoundest thanks." Sebastian inclined his head. He did not, himself, drink. He had stopped drinking 5 years before. On the day he had read his father's papers for the first time and understood what they meant. By 2 in the afternoon, they were in the carriage. 2 horses, 1 trunk. A cold cake of beeswax under the seat to keep their feet warm on the road. Eleanor did not look back as the gates of Thornfield closed behind them. There was nothing behind her to look at that she did not carry already on the inside of her ribs. She thought briefly of the bench in the rose garden. She thought of her mother at the breakfast table. She thought of Hannah, the village girl who came in 3 mornings a week, who had not been told yet what was happening, and who would, on Monday morning, arrive to find the Hartwells in a house that suddenly had money in it again, and a missing daughter she would never see at the table. It was, in its small way, a thought worse than any of the others. The people she had carried for years had been saved. The price of saving them was that she would no longer be the one carrying. The thought sat with her, oddly, all the way to the first posting in, and she did not know what to do with it, so she did not do anything. She watched the country slide past the window and held it in. Sebastian, opposite her, did not speak. He had not, at any point in the morning, asked her how she felt about any of it. She found, when she examined herself for the answer, that she preferred this. The unasked question which was, in this carriage at least, a small mercy. She was not ready to be asked. She did not know yet what she would have said. Ravenshaw stood 3 days north. Sebastian, in the carriage opposite her, opened a book on the second afternoon. He did not seem to feel that the silence between them needed words. For this she was grateful in a way she could not yet describe. She watched the country pass, russet to bronze to the slow gray of a different latitude. They crossed 3 rivers. They changed horses twice. They stayed 2 nights at posting inns where the landlord bowed too low, and Sebastian paid in clean coin without seeming to count. On the 3rd afternoon the road climbed. The trees thinned. The sky widened. And the house appeared. Ravenshaw was not Thornfield. It did not apologize. It had not been built to apologize. It rose out of the dark stone of the moor, as though some prior age had been simply unable to imagine its absence, and it had stayed there, severe and unchanging, while the world around it cycled its plagues and wars and small private griefs, a long avenue, a drive of pale gravel. Lamps already lit in the windows. Though it was barely past 4, the staff had assembled. 2 long lines of them in dark wool, against the dark stone, 24 in all. A house this size required more, but the household had been running thin for years, and Sebastian had not replaced the gaps. The faces were unfamiliar, alert, and not at all welcoming. A woman at their head stepped forward when the carriage stopped. Tall, iron-haired, black bombazine, iron keys at her waist that did not so much hang as preside Mrs. Whitcomb, housekeeper at Ravenshallow for 31 years. She had served Sebastian's grandfather as a parlour-maid, his father as a senior maid, and his mother, briefly, as a friend. The friendship had ended badly. She had outlived everyone she had ever quarreled with, and the experience had taught her not to attach again. She looked Eleanor up and down. Once. Twice. A small movement of the mouth that was not quite a thinning. "Your Grace Eleanor," inclined her head. "Well, Mrs. Whitcomb, welcome to Ravenshallow." The welcome had been used. "The way you use a coin you do not believe in but cannot, for protocol, refuse to spend." Eleanor did not flinch. She had been welcomed into rooms by less hospitable expressions all her life. "Thank you. I look forward to learning the house from you." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyebrows did a small thing. The first piece of information she had not yet decided how to file. Dinner that night was a small disaster. Not in any way an outsider would have noticed. The food was correct. The footmen were correct. The silver recently polished was correct. But the dining table at Ravenshallow was 32 feet long. It seated 40, and Eleanor's and Sebastian had been placed at opposite ends of it. Eleanor counted the place markers, sat down without comment, lifted her spoon to a clear soup the color of weak tea. Sebastian, across the great expanse, did the same. A footman brought him bread. A second footman brought her bread. The third course came. The fourth, it was, she realized, the way the previous Duke had dined. Probably the Duke before him. Probably every Ravensmore since the table had been built in 1614. A length of mahogany so vast that intimacy across it had ceased to be possible. A length designed for men who did not particularly want to look at their wives. She finished her soup. "By the fifth course," she said, very calmly, to the footman at her elbow, "is the table sectioned, James?" His name was not James. She did not yet know his name. Calling all under footmen James was the prerogative of the lady of the house. As Mrs. Whitcomb would later inform her in a tone almost like approval, "It is, Your Grace. How many leaves does it carry?" 8, Your Grace. Have them removed tomorrow." "All of them, Your Grace?" "All of them, please. We are 2. The footman did not look at the Duke. The footman did not, technically, need to. The order had been given by the Duchess. Whether it was carried out depended on what the staff of Ravenshallow decided. In the long after hours of the servants' hall, the new Duchess actually was. She did not yet know whether it would be carried out. She did, however, know she had given the order, and that giving it had been the first sentence she had spoken in this house as a person to whom anyone owed obedience. It tasted, she found, of nothing in particular, which was, perhaps, the right taste for a beginning. That night she was shown to her rooms. The Duchess of Ravensmore's apartments occupied the entire western wing of the second floor. A sitting room of pale green. A dressing room with 3 mirrors. A bedchamber whose canopied bed could have slept 5 with room to spare. A door, locked from her side, connected through her dressing room to a corresponding suite. His. The maid who attended her unpinned her hair without speaking, brushed it, plaited it, said only "Good night, Your Grace," and withdrew. Eleanor sat on the edge of the great bed. She did not weep. She had not wept yet. She did not see, in the present moment, what weeping would accomplish. She lay down. She did not undress further. She slept in her shift, with the canopy bed, feeling like the inside of a cathedral. The next morning she did not wait to be attended. She rose at 6. She dressed herself in the simple gray she had brought from Thornfield, because her other gowns had not been unpacked, because she had not yet ordered them to be. She found her way down through corridors she did not know by following the smell of bread. She walked into the kitchens. A scullery girl dropped a bowl. The cook turned with an oath that died in her mouth. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had been correcting a junior maid over the placement of a teapot, went very still. "Good morning," Eleanor smiled. The smile she had used on her mother for years. The smile that said, I am not asking permission. I am merely informing you. I am Eleanor. I should like to learn the house. Mrs. Whitcomb, will you show me? The cook stared at her. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at her. The scullery girl was, in fact, still in the act of staring at her own broken bowl on the floor. For a second, nothing in the room moved. Then Mrs. Whitcomb, who had served 3 generations of Ravensmore women, none of whom had ever, in any season of her 31-year memory, set foot in a kitchen before noon, inclined her head a precise half-inch. As you wish, your grace. And the slow, patient, quiet conquest of Ravenshallow Manor began. It was not a campaign you could see from a distance. She did not order, she asked. She did not interrupt. She listened. She walked through the still room and the linen press and the dairy and the laundry, and at each door she stopped a moment longer than she needed to, and she asked the name of whoever stood inside it, and she remembered the name afterwards. By the end of the first week, she could greet 17 members of the staff by their names without hesitation. By the end of the second, 23. By the end of the third, all 24. She had learned, besides, whose mother was ill in the village, and whose son had been promised an apprenticeship to a wheelwright in Newcastle, and would be leaving Ravenshallow in spring. She did not, in any of this, ask Mrs. Whitcomb's permission, but she did not fail to ask Mrs. Whitcomb's opinion, which were, Mrs. Whitcomb found, 2 entirely different things, and the new Duchess understood the difference. The library she discovered on the 8th day. A vast room, 2 stories, galleries with iron rails, 8,000 volumes that had not been moved on their shelves since 1789, dust in fingers' thicknesses on the upper rails, curtains so heavy with unaired darkness that pulling them open the first time sent up a cloud. Eleanor stood inside for a full minute, sneezing softly, while pale northern light fell. For the first time in a generation, onto the floor. She did not summon a maid. She fetched cloths herself. By supper time she had cleaned 3 shelves. By the end of the week, 11, Mrs. Whitcomb, watching from a doorway one afternoon as the new Duchess balanced on a small library ladder, reaching for the top of a row of bound Edinburgh Reviews, said nothing. But she pulled the maid Agnes aside the same evening and instructed her, very quietly, to begin laying a fire in the library at 4:30 every afternoon, because her Grace appeared to be making it her room, and her Grace was not to be allowed to make her room cold. It was the first concession the house made. It was not the last. Sebastian, in the same fortnight, watched. He did not speak of it. He came home from his rides. Long rides out across the moor, in a black coat that the wind whitened with rain, and he handed his gloves to a footman and walked through halls that had begun, in some small invisible way, to smell different. Beeswax where there had been only damp, lavender from the linen presses where there had been only old wool. The first time he passed a bowl of late roses on a hall table he stopped and looked at it for a long moment, as though it were a clue to a puzzle he had not been told he was solving. He found her in the library on the 11th day. She was kneeling on the floor, sorting a stack of volumes by date. She looked up when he came in. Her hair had a streak of dust across the front of it. There was, he noted with some private amusement, ink on her wrist. Forgive me, I should have changed for dinner. Don't! She paused. Don't change. Eat as you are. She did. They ate that night at a table that was no longer 32 feet long. The 8 leaves had been removed previously. The table was now a comfortable Bolton feet, and the 2 of them sat across it, within reasonable conversational distance for the first time since the wedding. Sebastian had not commented on the alteration, but she had seen him pause when he had entered the dining room and found the room refurnished around the shortened table. He had paused for half a breath, and then he had taken his seat, and he had said only, before unfolding his napkin, "This is an improvement." She had not at the time trusted herself to answer. She was learning to trust herself by inches. By the 3rd week, she had begun to make small, careful adjustments to other rooms. A bowl of apples on a sideboard. A small clock from one of the closed bedrooms moved to a corner of the drawing room that had been bare for years. The locked door between her dressing room and his was unlocked one Wednesday afternoon and remained that way. She did not, even then, walk through it. Neither did he, but it was unlocked. The fact of it sat between them quietly, like a thing they had agreed upon without speaking. The confession came on the 23rd night. She brought him tea. She did not need to. There were 3 footmen on duty in the corridor outside his study who could have brought it. But she had taken to walking past his study at this hour, and on this particular night, she had heard, through the door, the small, specific sound of a man pressing his palms against his eyes. She had paused outside the door for a long moment. Then she had gone to the kitchen herself, and prepared a tray and come back. She did not knock. She entered. He was at the desk, a ledger open. His shoulders had the slope of a man who had been at this column of figures for some hours, and had not yet made it come right. He looked up. The candlelight caught his face hard. He looked, suddenly, 10 years older than he was, and 10 years younger at the same time. A boy at the back of his eyes. Eleanor, you did not eat dinner. I know there are servants for this. I know, yes. But the servants are not your wife. She set the tray down. Beside it, a plate. Bread, cold ham, an apple. He stared at the tray for a long moment, as if it were a foreign instrument whose use he had not been instructed in. Sit, please, if you will. She sat. In the chair across the desk, hands folded. He did not speak, not for the better part of a minute. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the fire. He looked, briefly, and not at her face, at her hands. When he spoke, it was almost to the desk. Tinmere has flooded again. I know. He glanced up. You know, Mrs. Whitcomb mentioned it to me on Tuesday. She has a brother in Tinmere village. He writes, tell me. He told her? He told her about Tinmere, the silver mine in the north. 2,000 families fed by it. The main pump failed for the 3rd time in a year, and the cost of a replacement nearly the entire amount of her dowry. He told her about his father's debts, that had paid only the loudest creditors, and left a quiet system of unpaid suppliers, throttling every estate office from York to London. He told her about the houses he had sold, the carriages he had sold, the portraits he had not yet sold, because their sale would be the public sign that the great house of Ravensmore was finished. He told her, last, about Lord Edmund Blackmore. She had heard the name before, across a garden bench at Thornfield, in the dark, from her sister's mouth. She did not say so, not yet. She filed the fact away with the small dispassionate care of a woman filing away kindling for a fire. She had not yet decided when to light. He is my cousin. Second cousin. He stands next in line for the Ravensmore title if I die without a son. He has done so since I was 6. 6 is a long time to wait, it is. And he has waited it actively. Sebastian's eyes lifted, the first sharpness she had ever seen in them. Yes, how investments. Introductions to investments. Companies my father was urged into. Bonds that failed, a pattern, looking back, that does not quite resemble bad luck. It resembles. He paused. He could not, even now, quite say the word, engineering. That. And you cannot prove it. I cannot. She thought for a moment. Her hands had not moved from where she had folded them. She was beginning to understand that this conversation was the most important conversation she had ever been part of, and she would not waste it. Then we will. 2 words. So calm, they sounded almost casual. He looked at her. It was a long look. He had not been looked at, by anyone, in this way since his mother had been alive. With the simple, most unargued assumption that they were on the same side of whatever the world had set up against him. He realized, with an interior shock he hoped did not reach his face, that he had stopped expecting it. Years ago, Eleanor, yes, I was not given to you, you were given to me. The contract. He shook his head. Forgive me, I am saying this badly. I mean only, you did not ask for this. The debts. The mine. Blackmore. You owe none of it. You may, if you wish, take the upstairs library and the south rooms and have nothing to do with any of it. I will not be insulted by it. She let him finish. She's allowed a small silence to sit between them. Then she said very simply, your burdens are mine, Sebastian. She had used his given name, the one almost no one used now. His mother had been the last to use it. 8 years ago, he did not move. He did not, for some seconds, breathe. Then he reached slowly across the desk and put one hand over hers. Not gripping, just laying it there, as one lays a hand on the back of a horse one is asking to stand still. Then we begin. Properly. Together, it was the closest thing to a vow either of them had so far made aloud. It carried a weight the parish church had not. 3 weeks before, been able to provide. She nodded once. The fire crackled. The candle guttered slightly in some draught from the corridor. Somewhere in the long high galleries of Ravenshollow, a clock chimed 11. The campaign, though neither of them yet called it that, had begun. She did not in the end, leave the study until past 1 in the morning. They sat together at the desk and went through the ledger column by column. He explained the debts to her. She listened. She asked questions. She had not, in all her years at Thornfield, been allowed to look at her own father's accounts. The privilege had not been considered hers. Sebastian opened his to her without hesitation. He answered every question she asked. By the time the candle was guttering for the second time, Eleanor had the structure of the Ravensmore accounts laid out in her head as cleanly as she had ever laid out a household budget at Thornfield. She understood by then why Blackmore had been able to do what he had done. The 5th Duke had not paid attention. The accounts were full of holes a careful man could have walked through, and Blackmore had been a careful man. She did not yet know how to stop him. She knew only that she had decided to. They went south to London in February. The season would not formally open until April. But Sebastian had business in town that could not wait, and Eleanor had a townhouse to learn, and a city to be presented to, and a position to begin establishing in advance of the worst of the gossip. The house in Grosvenor Square was, after Ravenshollow, almost small. White, 5 stories. A staff of 14. A different rhythm. Carriages in the square at all hours. The cries of street vendors from before dawn. The London smoke that put a fine soft soot on every windowsill within a day of cleaning. Eleanor adjusted to it, the way she adjusted to everything, without complaint, without flourish. The first weeks were almost dull. Dinners at Sebastian's club for him, mornings of paying cards for her, the slow accumulation of acquaintances. A woman from Devonshire who liked her at once. A pair of dowagers who could not evidently decide whether to like her. A great aunt of Sebastian's named Lady Beatrice Ravensmore, 70 years old and almost frightening in her steadiness, who invited her to tea alone on the eighth day and spent 90 minutes asking her about Italian painters and the management of cottage tenancies. At the end of the visit, Lady Beatrice tapped her cane on the floor once. "You will do." "I am sorry?" "You will do. The boy needs a backbone in the room. He has been thin in the chest since his father died. You will give him one." Eleanor opened her mouth. Lady Beatrice waved her hand. "Don't argue. I am old. Arguing with the old is futile. Come again on Tuesday. I have a Caravaggio I should like to show you." Eleanor, in the carriage on the way home, found she could not stop smiling. She had not smiled at her own face in a mirror in some weeks. It happened by accident in the carriage glass. She caught her own reflection. She had smiled. She did not know yet what to do with that. Cordelia arrived in the 2nd week of March, uninvited. She had attached herself to the party of a 3rd cousin twice removed and turned up at the Grosvenor Square front door in the late afternoon, with a smile so bright it could have lit the entrance hall. "Eleanor, darling, I have come to see how you are getting on." She kissed both of Eleanor's cheeks. She kissed the air an inch from Sebastian's. She swept into the drawing room and looked at the curtains as if pricing them. Eleanor had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision. She decided Cordelia. "How wonderful. Will you stay through the season?" Sebastian's eyes cut sideways at her, sharp. She did not return the look. "Not yet. I shall stay as long as you will have me, sister. Then stay. We have rooms enough." She had her sister where she could see her. Which was? Eleanor had decided over the course of 3 carriage rides and 1 sleepless night in February. By a great distance, better than not having her at all. The campaign that had begun in a study at Ravenshollow had just acquired its 2nd front, Cordelia, in the privacy of her assigned guest bedroom that first evening, sat at her vanity and laughed quietly into the mirror. She did not know she had been deliberately housed there. She did not know that the bedroom was the only one in the London house from which the rear garden could be seen entirely. She did not, in fact, know any of a great many things. The most important fact she did not know was that her own elder sister, the quiet, dim, dull fool in the gray gown, had been planning what to do with her for 16 days. The poison began at once, a whisper at a card party. Eleanor's name placed in a sentence with the word strange. The story, told and retold with small embellishments, of how the Duke had been pressured by a clever scheming family in the country into a contract that the elder daughter had somehow stolen. The hints? The little suggestions. Poor Louisa. She was always so odd. One does wonder what hold she has over him. Cordelia did not call her Louisa to her face anymore. She had stopped. She called her, in the polite drawing rooms of the Tun, by her correct name. But the wrongness of the previous name lingered, like a stain not quite washed out, and the women receiving the gossip filed it away as the verdict of an exhausted sister. Even her own family does not quite remember what to call her. Ondor itations to certain houses cooled. Eleanor noticed. She did not respond. She continued to receive callers in the morning room. She continued to attend the houses she was still welcome in. She continued to take tea with Lady Beatrice, who was, Eleanor would discover much later, quietly burning the gossip on her own hearth, wherever it landed in her hearing, with a precision that left marks no one else could see. Sebastian wanted to send Cordelia away. He said so, low in their joint sitting room one evening, after a particularly bad dinner at the Devonshires, where Cordelia had spent the entire second course speaking sweetly to a baroness about how lonely the Duke had been before her sister had so courageously taken him on. "I will put her in a carriage tomorrow morning. No, Eleanor, no. That is what she wants. She wants you to behave like a tyrant. She wants the story to be that you are mistreating her, and that I am the cowed wife who cannot defend her own sister. We will not give her that, then what? We watch her." His eyes searched her face. He was, she realized with an interior small jolt, beginning to look at her the way one looks at a partner in a venture one had not realized one was capable of having a partner in. "You think she is being directed. I think she has neither the patience nor the discipline to have built this story alone. She is being prompted. I should like to know by whom." He let out a slow breath. "It will be him. I know Eleanor. I know Sebastian." She had been calling him by his given name in private since the night of the tea in his study. She had not used it in public. She had not corrected him to others. She was learning the etiquette of intimacy with the same attention a younger woman might bring to learning the etiquette of a court. He sat back in his chair. "What do you intend?" "To wait, to listen, and to walk in Lady Beatrice's garden after dark, when it stops raining." It stopped raining on a Thursday. That night there was a small reception at Lady Beatrice's, an informal evening of musicians and indifferent wine, the sort of gathering at which the elder generations dozed in armchairs, and the younger drifted out to corridors and conservatories to flirt out of earshot of their chaperones. Eleanor wore lavender. Cordelia wore gold. They walked in together. Eleanor noted, in the cloakroom, the way her sister's eyes moved at once to the windows that opened on the rear garden. She filed it. By 10:30, Cordelia had disappeared from the music room. Eleanor waited a courteous 5 minutes. Then she pleaded ahead and stepped out, past the conservatory, through a side door, onto the gravel path at the side of the garden where the lamps did not reach. She moved soft. She had been moving soft in houses her entire life. It was the one skill she had been taught by 24 years of being overlooked, and tonight she was, for the first time, prepared to thank her family for it. She found them at the stone basin at the back of the garden. 2 figures. The lamplight from the house caught only the edges of them. A man's voice, low, controlled, almost amused. "Patience, my dear. We are nearly through the worst of it. Patience does not suit me, it does not. But it pays." A small laugh from Cordelia, brittle, excited, The mine has flooded again. He cannot meet the call on the Newcastle bonds. 3 months. 6 at the outside. The bank will move. The trustees will move. And there will be a public sale of the entire northern estate. And then I take the title that was wrongly given, and you, my dear Cordelia, take the consolation prize of becoming Lady Blackmore in her place. I dare say the Duchess of Ravensmore will go off to a small house in Bath and grow her own potatoes. Cordelia's laugh again, sharp now, almost a giggle. And you have everything you need. Truly? Almost. There is one document from my uncle's library at Ravenshollow. A letter your dear brother-in-law's father wrote in 1801. If it can be removed, no one will be able to trace the original arrangements back to me. Without it, even if they suspect, they will not prove. You wish me to take it. I wish you to find it. I will arrange the rest. You will be at Ravenshollow this summer. Yes, then it will be done. The kiss that followed was brief. In its own way, almost businesslike, Eleanor stood behind the box hedge and did not move, and did not breathe, and did not, for some seconds, even allow her thoughts to gather into sentences. A letter. From 1801. Her father-in-law had written it. Sebastian's father had written it, which meant Sebastian's father had known, at least suspected, long enough to have written it down, which meant the evidence, the one piece of paper that could undo Lord Edmund Blackmore, was already in their possession. It only had to be found before Cordelia could take it. She did not sleep that night. She did not tell Sebastian, not yet, not until she had what she needed in her hand. She rose at 5. She went to the library. The Grosvenor Square library was small. She turned by 6:30 to the trunk in the corner of Sebastian's study that contained the private correspondence of the 5th Duke of Ravensmore, transferred in 3 boxes from the north, and never opened since. She worked all morning. She worked through luncheon. She told Mrs. Henderson, the London housekeeper, that she had a headache and would receive no callers. She worked into the afternoon. She found it at 4. A letter dated the 23rd of November, 1801. Sebastian's father's hand. A draft never sent. Filed by some careful clerk and folded in among a packet of crop accounts as though one of the two had been a mistake. To his solicitor in Edinburgh, I have begun to suspect, the letter read, that the late introductions to certain mining ventures in Cornwall and the further bond purchases in the Midlands, which Sivtos consistently failed to return capital, may not be the natural misfortunes I have until now considered them. Edmund's role in arranging each of these introductions, while presented as friendship, appears on this 15th review more pointed than amiable. I write this only for the record. I have not yet determined what to do. The letter went on for 2 more paragraphs, specific, dated, named Edmund. Edmund of Blackmore, his own younger cousin, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window, and held the paper in her hand, and felt for a long time nothing at all. Then she felt a great cold clean thing rise in her. Sebastian found her there at 6. He had been told by the housekeeper that the Duchess had had a head, and was not to be disturbed. He had not, on hearing it, listened. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the paper. Eleanor. She lifted it. She did not herself get up. See, Sebastian, I have found it. He took the letter. He read it. He read it twice. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was almost gentle, almost terrible. 15 years, 15 years. All of it. All of it. He folded the letter, very carefully, into thirds. He put it in the breast pocket of his coat, the inside pocket, the one over his heart. Then we do this together. Quietly. Completely. To the bone. She nodded. He came across the room, and he sat on the arm of her chair, and he did not, for several seconds, say anything more. He only rested his hand against her hair. Once. Lightly. As though to make sure she was real. Outside the window, a lamplighter was making his way along the square. The lamps came on, one by one, behind the bare trees. Lady Beatrice was told the next afternoon. She listened in silence. She made no exclamations. She did not, when it was finished, raise her cane. She said only, in a voice as level as a coastline, "Then we shall need a ball." Eleanor blinked. A ball, my dear, the largest of the season. Mine. April 15th. The whole of London will come, because the whole of London cannot bear not to. Your sister will attempt something. So will Edmund. So will whatever poor, desperate young man they have purchased between them. We will give them the room. And in front of every doger and every newspaper stringer and every gossiping general's wife, from St. James's to Mayfair. We will end the matter. Sebastian considered her. You wish to expose him in public. I wish to bury him in public. Privately, my nephew, the man is a snake. Privately is the language he speaks. Take him out of the privacy he has lived in for 15 years, and he will not know how to behave. Eleanor folded her hands. He will retaliate. He will try. He will try, my dear, with whatever weapon he has been preparing. We shall let him, and we shall be standing exactly where he aims. She tapped her cane. Now, the matter of your gown. Aunt, I beg you, child, allow me one thing. The gown. Eleanor did not argue. She had begun, in fact, to find arguing with Lady Beatrice a very specific kind of waste of energy. The gown arrived a week before the ball. It was not gray. It was not lavender. It was a deep, dark green, the green of moss in the deep north woods. Velvet so heavy it hung in folds the way water hangs in a still pool. A pale ivory underdress beneath. No frills, no bows, nothing decorative. It looked, in fact, more like a vestment than a ball gown. Sebastian was in the doorway of her dressing room when she stepped out in it for the first time. He did not immediately speak. She turned, slowly, to let him see. Eleanor, yes, you are not a shadow anymore. It was perhaps not what he had meant to say. It was certainly more than he had said about a gown in his life. He looked for a half-second, as though he might have surprised himself. She let the half-second pass. Then she crossed the room to him. She put her hand against the lapel of his coat, over the pocket, over where the letter sat. Nothing, she said. Not any more. The mirror behind her, the long pier glass in the dressing room, caught a moment between them that no one else would ever see. Outside, the carriages of London continued past the front of the house in the soft April rain. The ball was 4 days away. April 15th came with weather that could not make up its mind. A gray morning, a bright noon, a hard, sudden squall at 3 that ruined the gravel of every drive in Mayfair. By 6, the sky cleared so completely. The slates above Cavendish Square shone like wet plate, and a long line of carriages had begun to thread the streets toward the house at the corner. The largest ball of the season. Lady Beatrice had not given one in 7 years. The invitations had gone out 4 weeks previously on stiff cream paper with a single crest in dark green ink. Not one had been declined, not by a single peer from St. James's to Mayfair, not even by the houses currently not speaking to half the other houses on the same list. Curiosity had, in the end, beaten breeding. The Duchess of Ravensmore entered on her husband's arm at 32 minutes past 9. The room did not technically stop. The musicians did not technically miss a measure. But a thing happened in the way that happens when a roomful of strangers is suddenly all looking in the same direction. The small noises of conversation dropped by a single audible step at the same instant. Her hair was simple, unornamented, except for one small pearl pin at the back of her neck that Sebastian had given her that morning in the carriage without a single word about what it was for. He wore the black he had worn at his father's funeral. He had instructed the valet to lay it out specifically. He had not, when asked why, answered. Lady Beatrice met them at the door of the ballroom. She did not, in any visible way, react to the gown or the unornamented hair. She only laid a hand on Eleanor's wrist for 1 second. He is here, where 3 columns down, left side, beside the woman in puce. Eleanor did not turn her head. She did not need to. She had been watching for him from the moment they had walked in. Lord Edmund Blackmore, 40. Tall. The same long-faced Ravensmore profile his mother had brought into the family from a county branch, nobody now remembered. A small smile that he had been practicing in the mirrors of his own house for, by Eleanor's calculation, perhaps 2 months. His eyes met hers across the room. The smile did not move, but something behind it shifted. He had seen her gown. He had not been prepared, evidently, for the gown. The first waltz began at 10. Sebastian led her onto the floor without consultation. He put his hand at her waist. She put hers on his shoulder. They moved. She had thought, for some weeks now, about what it would be like to dance with her husband in public. She had imagined it. She had been wrong about most of it. She had not imagined that the rest of the room would simply, for the duration of the dance, cease to be present. She had not imagined that he would draw her 3/4 of an inch closer than was strictly proper, and that nobody at all would have the courage to remark on it. She had not imagined that he would speak only once in the whole of the dance, and that what he would say was, "Whatever happens tonight, you have already won, Eleanor." She had not imagined that her own answer would come out, as quietly as a hand placed against a window, "Then let us spend the win." When the dance ended, they did not bow and separate. They walked off the floor together, his hand still at the small of the back. The room around them quietly noted the way they had not let go. Cordelia moved at 11:03. She had been waiting at the edge of the floor in shimmering gold. Beside her stood a young man in a regimental coat, 25 years old. Lieutenant Edward Hastings of the 12th. He had played at the wrong tables for 3 seasons. He had not played well. He had not the funds to cover what he owed. Lord Blackmore, 2 weeks previously, had quietly paid the bonds. The lieutenant did not know who had paid them. He had only been told, by a man in a coffee house, that his bonds would be honored if he was willing to do a small kind favor to a lady whose feelings had been slighted. He was a stupid young man. He was not a bad one. He looked, at this moment, as though he wished very badly to be elsewhere. Cordelia drew him forward. "Eleanor, sister, how lovely. And Lieutenant Hastings. You remember Lieutenant Hastings, don't you?" The voice was pitched, just exactly so, to be heard by the 4 matrons and the columnist for the Morning Post, who were standing within range. Chenner turned. Slowly, with the composure of a woman who has watched a clock for 3 hours, knowing exactly when it would strike. "Lieutenant Hastings." Of course, the lieutenant managed a bow. It nearly went well. "I was just telling Lieutenant Hastings how lovely it is to see old friends reunited. Do you remember, dearest, those long walks by the river at Thornfield, you and the lieutenant? The lieutenant was always so fond of you. I do not know how my dear Sebastian managed to win you in the end." She rested a small hand on Eleanor's wrist. The grip looked sisterly. It was not. The 4 matrons within hearing had gone very still. The columnist had taken half a step closer. A different woman might here have flushed and stammered. Eleanor did not. She lifted her sister's hand off her wrist. Politely, as if returning a fan that had been mislaid, she looked at Cordelia, then at the lieutenant, then back at Cordelia. In a voice that was not loud, that was, in fact, quieter than the music had become a moment before. She spoke. "Before you continue this, Cordelia, I think you should know." A small pause. The kind of pause that empties a room 3 nights ago. In Lady Beatrice's own rear garden. I was on the path beside the box hedge, and I heard a conversation between you and Lord Edmund Blackmore concerning the management of my husband's affairs and the disposition of his title. The musicians in the gallery, by some accident of timing, finished their movement. The silence afterwards was absolute. Cordelia's face had not yet decided what to do. Her mouth was open, her hand was still where Eleanor had set it down. Behind her, the columnist from the Morning Post had begun very quietly to take out a pencil. "I do not know what you—" "Yes, you do, Eleanor. Shall I repeat what was said, sister, or will you?" The lieutenant, who had begun this with a slight shake, was now visibly trembling. He turned to look at the man whose face he could see through the parted crowd. Lord Blackmore, standing rigid at his column, the small practiced smile entirely gone. In that small turn of one stupid, frightened young man's neck, every person in the ballroom who had not yet understood what was happening, understood. Sebastian stepped forward. He had not moved during the previous exchange. He had stood, one hand resting lightly at Eleanor's elbow, the picture of a man whose wife was perfectly capable of conducting her own conversation. Now he moved, not quickly, not toward Cordelia. He went, in his slow, long stride, around the edge of the dance floor toward the column, where his cousin stood. The crowd parted for him in the way crowds part for men whose evening is about to other people's news. He stopped 3 feet from his cousin. He reached, with no haste at all, into the inside breast pocket of his coat, the pocket over his heart. He drew out a small folded packet of papers. He did not open it. He held it, simply, in his gloved hand. Lord Blackmore, his voice carried. He did not raise it. He did not need to. I have here, in this packet, the correspondence of my late father, covering the years from 1801 to 1808. 3 letters in his hand to his solicitor in Edinburgh. A signed statement from a Mr. Whitaker of Bristol, presently still alive, who acted as your agent in the Cornish mining ventures, and who has now provided a full deposition, and the original bond papers from the Newcastle issue of 1803, all bearing your introduction. He let the packet rest in his palm. For 15 years, sir, you have ruined my father's name. You have engineered the slow strangulation of my house. You have done this in the name of an inheritance you were never going to receive. You will, sir, this evening, account for it, to me, and, in due course, to a court, and to the gentlemen of the press standing behind me with their pencils. He paused. I had hoped, on first reviewing the evidence, to find I was mistaken. I have not been mistaken. I am sorry, sir. For both of us, Blackmore had gone the color of paper. His mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. Whatever he had been preparing for the evening, whatever insult, whatever lie, whatever quick, clean counter to a clumsy, frightened girl, none of it had been prepared for this. He looked left. He looked right. He looked for an instant toward the doors. 2 large gentlemen in the dark coats of Bow Street stood at each set of doors. They had been there since 9:30. Lady Beatrice had arranged it. Of course she had. He sat down. He sat down on the gilt chair behind him without warning. His knees, as it turned out, had failed. There was a small, undignified bump, and the chair rocked back against the column. A duchess 2 columns over made a small involuntary noise of surprise. It was, in the end, less a downfall than a folding. The man who had been arranging the slow, methodical destruction of an entire ducal house had crumpled a piece of gilt furniture in front of 398 witnesses, without ever having found his voice. Sebastian inclined his head to him, once, the smallest courtesy. The kind one extends to a wounded animal. He stepped back. He returned the packet to the inside of his coat. Cordelia, behind him, had not moved. She had been waiting, perhaps, for someone to come and rescue her. For her sister to laugh and turn it into a misunderstanding. For Blackmore to stand and deny it. For the lieutenant to swear she had misled him. None of these things had happened. A small sound escaped her. It was not a word. It was the sound of a person realizing that the room she had walked into is not the room she has been preparing for. Her face collapsed in 3 distinct stages over the course of perhaps 4 seconds. First the smile, then the eyes, then the mouth. She ran, not gracefully, with her gold skirts caught in one hand and her face hidden in the other, past the matrons, past the columnist, past Lieutenant Hastings, who would not have dared to look at her in any case, through the door at the end of the ballroom, into the corridor, and out, finally, into the soft April evening. Lady Beatrice tapped her cane, once, sharply, on the floor. Music the musicians, who had been frozen in the gallery, jolted into a country dance. She turned to Sebastian. Her eyes had a small bright glitter at the corner that was either tears or amusement, and at her age the two had likely become the same substance. Now, take your wife outside before half this room comes to congratulate her, and the other half comes to apologize. He offered Eleanor his arm. She took it. They walked through the corridor and out the side door into the small private garden at the back of the house, where the lamps had been lit and the night smelled of wet grass. He stopped under the laurel arch. He did not, at first, speak. Then he turned to her and he took her face very gently between his gloved hands. Eleanor, Sebastian, I love you. I think I have. From the moment I saw you put your hand against that rose. She did not weep. She had decided, weeks ago, Somewhere in the long carriage rides from one life to another, that her tears had been earned by other people for too long and would, henceforth, be paid only when they were owed. But she was paid, now, and freely. I love you, Sebastian. I have since the night you let me bring you tea. He pressed his forehead to hers. The night had cooled. Somewhere over Mayfair a single church bell was striking the half hour. He held her there for perhaps 30 seconds, and then he straightened, and the Duke came back into his shoulders, and he offered her his arm again. Then, "Let us go and finish the evening." They returned to the ballroom. The room received them with a small, half-audible, half-disbelieving wave of applause. Lady Beatrice, from beside the orchestra, met as once and inclined her head a fraction. The next morning, the newspapers carried it. 3 of them led with it. The Morning Post in particular, having had foresight to send their columnist, ran a full account that named names and provided even a small description of the gown. Within a week, Lord Edmund Blackmore had been formally indicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 of conspiracy. Within a fortnight his properties had been placed under sequestration. He fled, eventually, to towns far from England whose names Eleanor would never have to learn. His name would not be spoken in a London ballroom again. The 15-year campaign was, by the end of summer, dust. But the mine still flooded. Sebastian rode north in the first wagon. Eleanor went with him. She had asked to. She had said quite simply that she had spent the winter learning the names of every miner on the list at Tinmere, and she would not now learn the names of their widows. They arrived at the mine on a Tuesday morning. The shaft head stood at the bottom of a valley. The pump house was idle. The water in the main shaft had reached. The foreman explained with the controlled voice of a man who had been delivering bad news for 3 months the 7th level. Another month, and it would be at the 6th. A replacement pump would take 6 months, and most of what was left of the dowry. There was no time, Eleanor asked, at her end of the long deal table in the manager's office, for the original maps of the mine, not the modern ones, the old ones, the ones from before her father-in-law's time. The clerk looked at her. He looked at the Duke. The Duke, who had learned by now never to question her, only nodded. The clerk went to a chest in the corner of the office that had not been opened since 1804. He brought out 3 rolls of vellum. She unrolled them on the table. Drawn in a hand that had been gone for 6 generations. Cornish trained by the script. They had named every adit, every drift, every crosscut, in a careful sloping clerk's italic that the modern surveys had abandoned in favor of bare numerical reference. Eleanor put her finger on a faint line on the second roll, a drainage adit, dug in 1683, abandoned by 1701. Marked, on later maps, only as a faint ghost line. It descended from a point on the hillside above the modern shaft. It would, if it still held, drain the water in the main shaft by gravity alone to a stream half a mile down the valley. She looked up at the foreman. "This adit, if we cleared it, reopened it. How long?" The foreman stared at the line. He stared at her. He stared at the line again. 3 weeks. Maybe 4. A team of 20. The cost of dressing a timber alone, less than a new pump, less than a quarter of a new pump, your grace. Then begin tomorrow. She rolled the maps back up herself. She handed them to him. Sebastian caught her wrist outside the office door. "Eleanor, how did you?" "My grandfather was a country baronet, Sebastian. He read old surveys for entertainment. I sat in his library when I was 9. I have not forgotten." He looked at her for a long second. "You will be the saving of this house?" "No, we will be the saving of it. Each other, and of the men who do not yet know our names." The adit was cleared by the 11th of June. The water dropped 7 feet in the first day. By the 20th, the 7th level was working again. By the end of August, the mine was running at full pay, and 2,000 families had not, after all, gone to the workhouse. It was September the 11th when the carriage came up the long drive at Ravenshallow. Eleanor had been told nothing. She watched out from the morning room as the carriage drew up. A single woman descended. Yellow hair, much paled, a dress that had been fine and was now merely respectable. Cordelia had married in the late spring, an importer of porcelain from Liverpool. A wealthy man. A man almost 20 years her senior who had bought her the way one buys a porcelain figure, and who did not let her speak in his presence. She came up to the front door of Ravenshollow without ringing. Mrs. Whitcomb, who knew exactly who she was, did not open it. She sent for Eleanor. Eleanor went down. She opened the door herself. Cordelia stood on the step. The bright certainty was gone from her face. In its place was something Eleanor had never expected to see there. The small, worn caution of a person who has learned, very recently, what it is to be at the mercy of someone unkind. She held a letter. "Mama is ill. She asked me to bring this." Eleanor took the letter. She did not invite Cordelia in. Not at once. She looked at her sister for a long moment. She thought about the bench in the rose garden. She thought about the ballroom in April. She thought about the small porcelain merchant from Liverpool. And what kind of evenings, exactly, that man was now arranging for the beauty of the county. She did not, in that long moment, feel triumph. She felt instead a small, clean tiredness. The kind of tiredness one feels at the end of a long road one is glad to have walked. "Come in. Mrs. Whitcomb will bring tea. We will read Mama's letter together." Cordelia began to cry, quietly. Not the loud, beautiful crying of the girl who had screamed into a pillow at Thornfield. The other kind, the kind that does not perform. Eleanor put a hand, lightly, against her sister's elbow. She did not embrace her. She had not yet decided how much she would do, but she did not turn her away. "I forgive you, Cordelia. I will not say I have forgotten. I do not think I shall. But I forgive you, because I do not wish to carry your weather inside me for the rest of my life." Cordelia covered her face. The letter in Eleanor's hand crinkled where Cordelia leaned against her. "I am sorry, Eleanor." "I know." They went inside. Mrs. Whitcomb, watching from the corridor, did something she had not done in 31 years at Ravenshollow. She nodded, once, in approval. Then she went to put on the kettle. 1 year later, the autumn light through the windows of the Ravensall Ire was a particular yellow. The kind that only comes through old glass. Eleanor sat in the armchair by the fire. A book in her lap she had not, for some minutes, been reading. 8 months old, dark hair already. The Ravensmore gray in his eyes. Sebastian was on the floor with the boy. The Duke of Ravensmore, on his own carpet, on his elbows. Him strolling a small carved wooden horse to his son who had just discovered the existence of carved wooden horses and was extremely interested in the inquiry. The Tinmere mine had run at clean profit for the entire summer. The debts had been paid. The west wing of Ravenshollow had been opened and the south rooms repainted. A new wing had been added at the back for nurseries. Cordelia wrote, once a month, careful short notes. The porcelain merchant had died of an apoplexy in the spring. She lived now in a small house in York that her sister had bought for her, with a single maid and a small income, and she taught French to the daughters of 2 merchants. She had taken to writing poetry. None of it would be published. But she wrote it anyway, and Eleanor read the poems she sent, and answered them gently. And the wound between them, while it had not healed, had at least stopped bleeding. Sir Reginald had died in the spring. Quietly. In Bath. Lady Margaret continued in the cottage there with 2 servants, and Eleanor visited twice a year. Sebastian looked up from his horse and met Eleanor's eyes across the carpet. He smiled. It was not any more the half-smile he had carried at the beginning. It was a whole smile. The kind that reached his eyes and made the boy on the carpet, in some baby way, smile back at the change in the shape of his father's face. "What are you thinking about?" "A stone bench." In a ruined garden. The shape of the light through the petals of a dying rose, and the woman who sat on it. Yes. "I think about her too, Eleanor." Every day the fire moved. The clock on the mantel struck 4. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had come up from the kitchens with a fresh pot of tea, set it down and did not interrupt them, and went away. "Before you go, sit with me a moment, because there is something in Eleanor's life that I have been turning over since we began, and I would like, if you will let me, to leave it here for you. How many Eleanors have you walked past today, in your own kitchen, in your office? At the diner where you have your coffee. The quiet one. The one who does not raise her voice. The one who does the small unglamorous work of holding a place together while everyone else is busy being seen. We are not, most of us, trained to notice such people. We were trained to notice the Cordelias, the bright ones, the performing ones, the ones who walk into a room and arrange the room around themselves. We were taught, somewhere along the way, that the loudest signal in a room is the most important one. It is not. There is a kind of person in this world who does the work without claiming the credit, who does not stop to make sure they are being thanked, who, when the family wakes up in the morning, has already been awake for 2 hours making the coffee, who, when the company posts its quarterly results, has been doing the small careful work all year that made the results possible, who, when the marriage survives, is the one who has been quietly choosing to stay. These people are easy to overlook. They are designed to be easy to overlook. They have, over the course of years and sometimes decades, learned to take up the least possible room in the houses they live in. So they will not be a burden, so they will not be a bother, so they will keep being loved. And we walk past them, year after year, the way Cordelia walked past Eleanor across one breakfast table after another, without ever quite seeing, until one day. Sometimes, if we are very lucky, a stranger walks into our hall and stops in front of the quiet one, and does what no one in our own family ever bothered to do. He sees her. Sebastian was not, in himself, an extraordinary man. He was a duke. He was, by the standards of his world, not especially clever. He was certainly not particularly tender. What he was, in the end, was attentive. He paid attention. He went to look at his future family before he signed his name to them. He listened to a voice through the branches of a tree, and he did not, hearing it, dismiss it. He took the trouble to actually look at the woman in gray. That is the rarest thing one person can give another. To actually look. There is something else. Eleanor was the only person in the entire campaign who could move freely. She heard the conversations, the people who mattered, did not think she counted enough to overhear. She read the documents nobody had thought to lock against a wife who was, surely, only a wife. She walked, soft, in houses where her sister had announced it herself. Being underestimated, in the end, became the door through which she walked back into her own life. And the last thing, the thing about her sister, Eleanor forgave Cordelia. She did not do it because Cordelia deserved it. She did not do it because forgiveness was the correct moral move. She did it because she had carried Cordelia in some inner place inside herself for 24 years, and she did not wish to carry her for another 24. The act of forgiveness, when she came finally to it, was not something she was giving her sister. It was a key turning in a lock she had been on the wrong side of. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of the quiet ones in your own life have you ever stopped to actually look at? How many of them have you ever, even once, sat down across from and asked, "What is the work you have been doing all the years that I never thanked you for?" If a story like Eleanor's has stayed with you, tell me, in the comments below. Have you ever been the one in the gray dress in your own family? The one no one noticed until someone finally did? Or were you the one who, late one afternoon, finally looked up and saw a person you had been walking past your whole life? Write it. I read everyone. And if you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, I would be honored if you would subscribe. The autumn light through the windows of Ravenshollow that afternoon was a particular kind of yellow, the kind that only comes through old glass. Eleanor sat at the fire. Sebastian was on the floor with the boy. And the woman who had once been the quiet one in a falling-down manor in October 1817 was, on this autumn afternoon 18 months later, simply at home,